This is a brief introduction to the imaginary number I. We use I to represent the square root of -1. So if we have the square root of -1, we can replace it with the letter I, lowercase letter I to be very specific. What this does is it allows us to open up a branch of mathematics that we can't see or calculate when we're dealing with real numbers. So anytime we're given a radical and we see a negative under the radical, we can actually we can consider that to be a -1, and we can pull an I out of the radical. So if we have something like the square root of -a, we can consider this to be the square root of -1 times a, and then we can take the square root of -1 as I, and then the square root of a would stay the square root of a, or if we can simplify it, we would simplify it. You should talk to your professor about where he or she prefers you put the I. Some professors prefer it go in front of the radical. Other professors prefer it go behind the radical. Just make sure if you put it behind the radical, it's very not under the radical, because the square root of I is not the same thing as I itself. So if you do write it behind, just make sure that the radical ends and I is off to the side away from the radical. Let's look at simplifying some perhaps numbers that will have the imaginary number. So we have the square root of -25. We know that this is not a real root. There is no real number that you can multiply to itself to give you something negative. So what we would do is we would write this as -1 times 25, and then the square root of -1 is I, and the square root of 25 is 5, which I would put in front of I no matter what. I would not put I5, I would put 5I, just sort of treated like a variable. So this would be 5I. Then for B, we have the negative square root of -81. This negative is okay. It's included in the real number system. It's this one that presents a problem. So we would say negative square root of -1 times 81, and then we're going to look at these square roots separately. So the square root of -1 is I. We're going to include this negative, and then the square root of 81 is 9. So this would be -9I. Letter C, we have the square root of -48. So we might consider this to be the square root of -1 times 48. Then -1 is I, and then the square root of 48 we want to break down. 48 is not a perfect square. It does have a few perfect square factors, such as 16. So I'm going to rewrite it as 16 times 3. Then the square root of 16 is 4, so I'm going to pull the 4 out in front of the I, and then the radical 3 the 3 would remain under the radical. Lastly, letter D, we have the negative square root of 72. Just want to make sure you're paying attention here because this is a real number. So this one does not use I. The negative is in front of the radical. So we do not use I in this case. We're just going to simply simplify the radical. So 72 has some perfect square factors, the biggest of which is 36. So we'll rewrite it as 36 times 2. Then it would be negative. The square root of 36 is 6. The square root of 2 is just the square root of 2. And this would be our final simplification here.